2 in the morning. Forward Operating Base Al-Asad. The ANTPY-2 radar array was already tracking a signature that should not have existed. The air defense operators had been on high alert for 72 hours, but the icons now blooming across their consoles were not the slow, low-altitude drones they had trained for. Something was screaming out of western Iran, climbing toward the edge of space at 5 times the speed of sound. The dry desert air outside the reinforced Tactical Operations Center was cold and still, smelling of diesel exhaust and the faint, metallic scent of the surrounding sand. Inside, the only sound was the low hum of cooling fans and the rhythmic, urgent clicking of keyboards as the crew of the 31st Air Defense Artillery Brigade verified the data. The primary sensor, located 30 miles to the east, had locked onto a solid fuel ballistic signature. This was a Zolfaghar missile, a weapon designed for one purpose: the high-speed destruction of hardened targets at ranges of up to 700 kilometers. It was not a warning shot. It was not a provocation by a local militia. This was a direct, state-level kinetic strike against a sovereign United States facility. The track began at a launch point near Kermanshah, Iran. The missile had cleared its launch rail 3 minutes prior, punching through the atmosphere with nearly 2,000 pounds of high explosives in its nose cone. The tactical data link flashed red, synchronized across every screen in the center. The projected impact point sat directly in the center of the Al-Asad flight line, a coordinate measured at 34 degrees north, 42 degrees east. Flash precedence to Central Command, the tactical director ordered. His voice was flat, professional, and devoid of the adrenaline currently surging through the room. Confirming inbound ballistic threat. Multiple re-entry vehicles. Time to impact is 4 minutes and 20 seconds. The commander of the air defense battery adjusted his headset. He looked at the secondary screen, which showed the status of the Patriot missile batteries situated on the western perimeter of the base. The launchers were already slewing, their hydraulic motors whining as they aimed at a patch of black sky where the enemy was currently invisible to the human eye. The base remained in a state of deceptive quiet. Outside the operations center, most of the 2,000 personnel were in their corrugated metal housing units, oblivious to the fact that a ton of Iranian steel and explosive was currently falling toward them. From the vacuum of the upper atmosphere, the moon was a thin sliver over the horizon, casting long, pale shadows across the rows of refueling trucks and parked transport aircraft. Inside the radar room, the trajectory continued to sharpen. The Zolfaghar was now in its terminal phase. It had reached its apogee and was beginning its descent, gravity adding to the tremendous thrust of its motor. The speed was now exceeding 6,000 kilometers per hour. At this velocity, the friction of the air began to heat the nose cone to over 1,000 degrees. The operators watched the intercept geometry. The Patriot system, a Mark III version, was designed for this specific moment. But the math was unforgiving. A ballistic missile falling at that angle created a tiny window for a successful kill. 1 second of delay in the command and control loop would result in an intercept that occurred too low, allowing the debris and the warhead to continue their path onto the base. Battery 1, engage, the commander said. 2 miles away, the first Patriot interceptor ignited. A pillar of white fire tore into the night, illuminating the desert for miles, in every direction. The sound followed seconds later. A bone-shaking roar that alerted every soldier on the base that the war had arrived. A second interceptor followed 3 seconds later, its exhaust trail carving a white line through the darkness as it chased the inbound threat. The 2 interceptors climbed at a steep angle, their onboard seekers searching for the heat signature of the Zolfaghar. On the radar screens, the 2 blue icons moved to meet the single, aggressive red dot. The operators held their breath, their hands hovering over their consoles. The fate of the entire base now rested on a series of automated calculations performed in millionths of a second. The cold desert wind rattled the doors of the operations center. Somewhere in the distance, a siren began to wail, the rising and falling tone signaling a red alert. It was the sound of a transition, the end of a tense peace, and the beginning of a morning that would be defined by fire and steel. 2 hours and 5 minutes past midnight. The National Military Command Center in Arlington, Virginia. The signal from Al-Asad arrived at the Pentagon via the wideband global SATCOM system in less than 3 seconds. On the massive digital displays of the command center, a localized map of Iraq was instantly overlaid with red telemetry vectors. The watch officer, a Navy captain, did not need to wait for the analysis. The speed and the point of origin were unmistakable. Iran had crossed the threshold from proxy warfare to a direct kinetic assault on the United States military. The air in the command center was climate-controlled to a precise 68 degrees, smelling faintly of ozone and floor wax. But the atmosphere was electric, with the sudden surge of operational urgency. In the middle of the room, the secure video teleconference was already active. The faces of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and the commander of United States Central Command appeared on the primary monitors. They were being briefed in real time as the Zolfaghar missiles reached the peak of their ballistic arc. The president has been notified, the chairman said, his voice transmitted through encrypted fiber optic lines. Rules of engagement are now set to standing ROE-2 Alpha. All regional assets are authorized for self-defense and immediate counter-battery fire if launch sites are verified. 5,000 miles away, the commander of Central Command sat in his hardened headquarters in Qatar. He was watching the same radar feed as the operators at Al-Asad. He saw the Patriot interceptors launch, their blue trails arching toward the red threat. He also saw what the operators on the ground were just beginning to realize. The first missile was not alone. Behind it, 3 more signatures had appeared on the long-range AN/SPY-6 radar arrays of the destroyers in the Persian Gulf. It is a coordinated salvo, the general said. They are trying to oversaturate the Patriot battery's processing capacity. We have 4 inbounds on Al-Asad, and 2 more appearing to head toward the consulate in Erbil. The command chain shifted into a state of high-velocity coordination. The order was sent to the United States Air Force Combined Air Operations Center. Within seconds, 2 15E Strike Eagles, already in the air over northern Iraq, were diverted. Their mission was not to intercept the missiles, which was impossible for a fighter jet, but to loiter near the border and identify the mobile transporter erector launchers before they could go back into hiding. At the same time, the order reached the USS Mason and the USS Nietzsche, 2 destroyers patrolling the Gulf. Their Aegis combat systems were slaved to the regional tracking network. The ships began to turn, their hulls cutting through the dark, oily water of the Gulf at 30 knots, preparing to provide secondary sensor coverage and, if necessary, launch Tomahawk cruise missiles at the source of the fire. Back at Al-Asad, the base commander was on a secure handheld radio. He was moving through the hardened bunkers, checking on the status of the Rapid Reaction Force. "I want every man in a vest and a helmet," he ordered. "If those Patriots miss, this entire flight line is going to become a blast furnace. Move the medical teams to the Bravo bunker now." The silence of the command chain was broken only by the steady, clinical updates of the tracking officers. To an outside observer, it would look like a series of men and women looking at screens. But the reality was, a global machine moving at the speed of light. Every decision made in Arlington or Qatar was being translated into physical actions on a desert floor in Iraq. The clock on the wall showed the seconds ticking down. The first Zolfaghar was now 60 seconds from impact. The command center in Virginia went quiet. There was nothing more to be said from 5,000 miles away. The engagement had moved beyond the reach of policy and strategy. It was now a matter of physics, of kinetic energy, and of the reliability of the software inside the Patriot missiles. The general in Qatar leaned forward, his eyes fixed on the merge point of the icons. "Come on," he whispered. "Hold the line." The desert outside Al-Asad was suddenly illuminated by a flash of light, so bright it cast shadows for 10 miles. The first interceptor had reached its target, but on the radar screen, the red icon did not disappear. It fragmented. The warhead had not been vaporized, it had been diverted, and it was still falling. 2 hours and 7 minutes past midnight. the western perimeter of forward operating base Al-Asad. The PAC-3 Patriot missile batteries were fully integrated into the terminal high-altitude area defense network, their hexagonal launch canisters tilted at a 60-degree angle toward the Iranian border. The second and third interceptors had already cleared their rails, leaving behind a thick, acrid cloud of white chemical smoke that hung heavy in the cold desert air. The smell of burnt propellant was overwhelming, a sharp, biting odor that cut through the scent of diesel and dust. On the perimeter, the counter-rocket, artillery, and mortar systems, known as CRAM, began their automated startup sequence. These 20mm Gatling guns, slaved to local Ku-band radar, were the base's last line of defense against smaller threats or falling debris. Their barrels began to rotate with a high-pitched metallic whine, searching for targets in the lower atmosphere while the Patriot missiles handled the primary ballistic threats 5 miles above. All stations, this is Al-Asad Control. The base commander's voice crackled over the secure wireless net. Impact is imminent. Go to ground. I repeat, all personnel go to ground. In the nearest hardened structure. This is not a drill. Inside the concrete T-wall barriers of the flight line, the ground crews for the MH-60 Sierra helicopters abandoned their refueling operations. They scrambled toward the coffin lockers, reinforced concrete bunkers designed to withstand overpressure from a 1,000-pound blast. The soldiers moved with the practiced efficiency of 1,000 drills, their boots rhythmic against the gravel, the only other sound being the distant, thunderous booms of the interceptors, detonating in the upper atmosphere. The radar operators in the Tactical Operations Center watched the telemetry with clinical focus. The first Zolfaghar missile had been hit, but the intercept was not clean. The kinetic kill vehicle had struck the booster section rather than the warhead itself. Instead of vaporizing, the missile had sheared into several massive pieces of hot steel, including the 2,000-pound high-explosive nose cone, which was now tumbling toward the Earth at 3 times the speed of sound. Interception achieved, but target remains ballistic, the radar sergeant shouted. The warhead is still active. Estimated impact point is now shifting 300 meters south, toward the primary fuel farm and the C-13J Hercules parking area. The C-RAM systems on the south side of the base suddenly opened fire. The sound was not like a traditional gun, but a continuous, mechanical scream, a buzzsaw noise that vibrated through the chests of every soldier in the bunkers. Bright red tracer rounds, fired at a rate of 75 rounds per second, stitched a glowing line into the black sky. They were attempting to shred the smaller fragments of the incoming missile before they could strike the base. The sky above Al-Asad was now a chaotic tapestry of white smoke trails, red tracers, and the sudden, blinding flashes of proximity fuses. The temperature on the flight line seemed to rise as the kinetic energy of the falling debris heated the air. A large section of the Zolfaghar's fuel tank, still containing traces of solid propellant, slammed into the empty desert 500 meters outside the fence, creating a localized fireball that bleached the sand white for 3 seconds. In the medical bunker, the triage teams had already laid out their supplies. They worked in the dim green glow of emergency lights, the smell of antiseptic and rubber gloves filling the cramped space. They could hear the C-RAMs firing, the sound echoing through the thick concrete walls like a hammer hitting an anvil. Every person in that room knew that the shield was failing. The Patriot system was the best in the world, but it was being asked to stop a saturating strike, designed specifically to find the gaps in the armor. The air inside the bunkers grew thin and hot. The soldiers pressed their bodies against the cold concrete floors, hands over their ears, eyes clamped shut. They waited for the physical shockwave that they knew was coming. The tactical positioning was complete. The technology had done all it could. The shield had been raised, but the sheer mass of the Iranian strike was beginning to overwhelm the perimeter. Multiple terminal signatures, the radar sergeant reported, his voice dropping an octave. 10 seconds to impact. Brace, brace, brace. 2 hours and 8 minutes past midnight. The terminal descent phase. The sky over the Al-Anbar province was no longer dark. It was a jagged landscape of strobe light flashes and expanding rings of white vapor. The second and third Iranian missiles were now entering the lower atmosphere, their guidance fins screaming as they adjusted their final descent paths. These were not the crude scuds of the previous century. The Zolfaghar utilized a maneuverable re-entry vehicle, designed to jink and weave in the final seconds to evade the very interceptors currently rising to meet them. On the radar screens at the Tactical Operations Center, the three red icons were moving with terrifying precision. Each one represented nearly 900 kilograms of high explosives wrapped in a hardened steel casing. The speed of the falling ordnance created a sonic boom that rolled across the desert like a continuous wave of thunder, shattering the windows of the older plywood structures on the base's eastern edge. The air around the incoming missiles began to ionize, creating a faint, ghostly blue glow around the nose cones as they compressed the atmosphere. This was the physics of the kill chain, pure kinetic energy being converted into heat and pressure. The Zolfaghar's solid propellant motor had long since burned out, but the momentum carried it forward at over 1,700 meters per second. Battery 2. Ripple fire. The tactical director commanded. Four more Patriot interceptors erupted from their canisters in a rapid sequence. The white pillars of fire rose to meet the red streaks descending from the stars. In the vacuum of the high atmosphere, the first of these interceptors found its mark. There was a silent, brilliant flash of white light as the kinetic kill vehicle slammed into the second Zolfaghar. This time, the intercept was clean. The Iranian missile was pulverized, its warhead detonating harmlessly 12 miles above the Earth, in a fireball that was visible as far away as Baghdad. But the third and fourth missiles were already too low. The Patriot radar struggled to maintain a lock as the missiles entered the clutter of the horizon and the heat signatures of the burning debris. The Zolfaghar's onboard computer executed a pre-programmed terminal maneuver, diving at a near-vertical 80-degree angle. On the flight line, the silence between the CRAM bursts was more terrifying than the noise. The soldiers in the bunkers could hear a sound like a freight train falling from the sky, a low-frequency roar that vibrated the very marrow of their bones. The air grew thick with the smell of ozone and the scorched earth scent of ionized nitrogen. The fourth missile, designated Target Hotel 6, was tracking toward the primary maintenance hangar. Inside that hangar were three MQ-9 Reaper drones, each loaded with fuel and Hellfire missiles. If the hangar were hit, the secondary explosions would level everything within a 400-meter radius. Target Hotel 6 is inside the minimum engagement zone, the radar sergeant shouted. Patriots cannot tracking. CRAM has no solution. Impact in 4, 3, 2. The Zolfaghar did not hit the hangar. Instead, it struck the reinforced concrete taxiway 60 meters to the north. The impact was not a sound so much as a physical displacement of the universe. The concrete, 2 meters thick and reinforced with steel rebar, acted like a liquid under the force of the strike. A crater 30 meters wide and 10 meters deep opened instantly, sending slabs of concrete the size of pickup trucks flying 500 feet into the air. The shockwave hit the maintenance hangar a fraction of a second later. The steel doors were sucked inward as if made of paper, and the overpressure wave shattered the reinforced glass of the control tower 3/4 of a mile away. The heat from the impact flash was so intense it scorched the paint off the side of a parked refueling truck, but the primary warhead had failed to detonate on contact. For 3 seconds, there was a stunned, ringing silence. Then, the delayed action fuse inside the Zolfaghar's nose cone reached its countdown. The primary explosion of the fourth missile was the signal that the engagement had shifted from a defense to a catastrophe. The ground under Al-Asad rose and fell like the deck of a ship in a storm. The battle for the base was no longer about radars and interceptors. It was now about the raw, violent reality of high explosives meeting human infrastructure. 2 hours and 9 minutes past midnight. The central flight line and fuel storage depot. The fifth and final Zolfaghar missile arrived without a whisper of radar warning. While the base's attention was fixed on the massive crater to the north, this final warhead punched through the low-hanging smoke of the previous intercepts. It was moving at 2,000 meters per second when it made contact with the primary fuel farm, a cluster of 6 massive steel bladders containing 400,000 gallons of JP-8 aviation fuel. The impact was a physical violation of the landscape. The warhead did not just explode. It drove deep into the earth beneath the storage bladders, detonating with a force that compressed the air into a visible, shimmering wall of pressure. The steel-reinforced retaining walls were pulverized instantly, turned into a storm of gray dust and jagged shrapnel. A column of fire, 300 feet wide and 500 feet tall, erupted into the night sky, bleaching the stars out of existence. The heat was so intense that the sand within 50 meters turned instantly to black glass. The shockwave slammed into the nearby barracks, the pressure wave punching through the reinforced T-walls like they were made of dry plywood. The blast wave threw men off their feet, tossing 300-pound concrete blocks as if they were pebbles. Inside the medical bunker, the pressure compressed every chest in the compartment, forcing the air out of lungs in a single, painful gasp. The sound was not a bang, but a tectonic roar that cracked eardrums and shattered every piece of glass within a 2-mile radius. The defending side reacted with the frantic energy of survivors. On the perimeter, the CRAM operators, their ears bleeding from the overpressure, frantically slewed their guns toward the fire, though there was nothing left to shoot. In the bunkers, soldiers scrambled over one another in the dark. The air now thick with the acrid chemical stink of burning JP-8 and the metallic tang of vaporized steel. One sergeant, his face blackened by soot, kicked open the jammed door of a housing unit, dragging a dazed private out just as the roof collapsed under the weight of falling debris. The immediate aftermath was a scene from a technical hell. Black smoke, thick and oily, boiled out of the crater, rising so high it was picked up by regional weather satellites. The burning fuel flowed like lava across the taxiways, turning the darkness into a flickering, orange-hued nightmare. The radio channels, which had been crisp and professional moments ago, erupted into a chaotic symphony of overlapping voices, screams for medics, and the rhythmic, high-pitched chirping of personal distress beacons. 2 hours and 11 minutes past midnight. The primary hardened Tactical Operations Center. The command center was a windowless, reinforced concrete monolith designed to survive anything short of a direct nuclear strike. Inside, the air smelled of ozone, recycled oxygen, and the metallic tang of overheated electronics. But as the 6th and 7th Zolfaghar missiles part of a second, unexpected wave cleared the horizon, the facility's invulnerability was put to the ultimate test. The trigger was squeezed in the heavens as the final Patriot interceptors screamed off their rails. The first of the incoming missiles was clipped, its guidance fins severed by a proximity blast, sending it tumbling wildly into the open desert. But the 7th missile remained on its programmed path. It shrieked through the smoke of the burning fuel farm, a white column of fire punching downward as it locked onto the heat signature of the command center's ventilation stacks. The warhead punched straight through the 3-meter-thick reinforced concrete roof, the hardened steel nose cone driving into the structure before the secondary delay fuse triggered. The detonation was a catastrophic release of energy that cracked the primary support pillars like dry kindling. The turret-like communication array on the roof was blasted off, 6 tons of steel and satellite dishes sent flying into the darkness. A fireball erupted inside the upper level, bleaching the darkness white and instantly vaporizing the sophisticated server racks. The shockwave inside the bunker was a wall of solid air. The blast wave threw the controllers off their feet, slamming their bodies against the consoles and the rear bulkheads. The pressure compressed every chest in the room, forcing blood from the noses and ears of the staff. The sound was a detonation that cracked eardrums, followed by the terrifying, screeching groan of metal tearing as the ceiling began to sag. The defenders showed the specific physical reaction of a unit refusing to break. Despite the darkness and the smoke, the tactical director crawled back to his station, his hands shaking. As he reached for the emergency override, his eyes were wide, and sweat ran down his soot-stained neck as he felt the floor shuddering beneath his feet. "Status report," he gasped. but the radio was a mess of static and screams. The survivors in the room did not panic. They moved by instinct, dragging injured comrades away from the burning electrical panels and toward the emergency egress tunnels. The immediate aftermath was a suffocating silence, broken only by the hiss of the fire suppression system and the distant, muffled roar of the fuel farm still burning outside. Black smoke, thick with the smell of burning plastic and copper, filled the room. The command center, once the brain of the base, was Estamagadar, now a hollowed-out shell of shattered glass and twisted steel. The battle for Al-Asad had moved into its most desperate phase, the struggle for survival in the wreckage. 2:30 in the morning, the medical triage center at Forward Operating Base Al-Asad. The dust from the command center collapse had not yet settled when the first casualties arrived. The air around the medical bunker was thick with the smell of burning rubber, JP-8 fuel, and the copper-iron scent of blood. The emergency lights flickered, casting long, erratic shadows across the concrete walls. Outside, the sky was a bruised purple, lit from below by the massive, flickering orange glow of the burning fuel farm. "We have 3 priority ones coming in from the flight line," a medic shouted over the roar of a nearby generator. The first medical evacuation helicopter, an MH-60 Sierra, was already on approach. It did not use landing lights. The pilot flew by infrared, the rotors kicking up a storm of grit and debris that pelted the medics waiting on the pad. The helicopter settled onto the concrete with a heavy thud, its engine screaming, against the resistance of the hot, thin air. As the side doors slid open, the triage teams moved in. They pulled 3 litters from the cabin, the soldiers on them covered in gray concrete dust and blackened by the soot of the fuel fire. One soldier had sustained a severe shrapnel wound to the upper thigh. The tourniquet was already in place, but the white fabric of his uniform was soaked through with dark red. The medics worked with frantic, mechanical precision, their hands moving in a blur of gauze, antiseptic, and plastic tubing. The evacuation of the wounded was a logistical nightmare performed under the shadow of a potential third wave. Every time the base's long-range radar hummed, every heart in the medical bunker skipped a beat. The threat of more Zolfaghar missiles hung over them like a guillotine. The secondary triage area was set up in a half-collapsed maintenance hangar, where 42 personnel sat or lay on the floor, their eyes hollow, their bodies shaking from the after effects of the overpressure shockwaves. The flight surgeon, a colonel with 30 years of experience, moved from litter to litter. His voice was a calm, low-frequency anchor in the chaos. "Keep the pressure on that leg. Get me 2 liters of saline here. Start a line on the sergeant in the corner." He didn't look up as a second MH-60 Sierra touched down, the downdraft nearly blowing over the portable oxygen tanks. By 3 in the morning, the evacuation chain reached back to the Landstuhl Regional Medical Center in Germany. The C-17 Globemaster aircraft, acting as a flying hospital, was already fueled and waiting at a base in Kuwait. The mission was clear: move the critical patients out of the strike zone before the sun rose, and provided the Iranian spotters with a clear view of the damage. The logistics of the evacuation were as vital as the surgery itself. Every ounce of blood, every roll of bandages, and every liter of fuel for the helicopters had to be accounted for in a base that had just lost its primary command and control hub. Medics used hand signals and shouted orders to coordinate the movement of the litters, their voices hoarse from the smoke. The wind shifted, blowing a fresh cloud of acrid smoke from the burning ruins of the command center over the triage pad. The medics pulled their masks tighter, their eyes stinging, but they did not stop. They were the bridge between the violence of the missile strike and the hope of recovery. For the 75 personnel, now identified as wounded in action, that bridge was the only thing that mattered. 6:30 in the morning. Forward Operating Base Al-Asad. The sun rose as a pale, blood-red disk through the thick curtain of black smoke that still drifted from the southern perimeter. The desert was no longer a uniform tan. It was scarred with craters, blackened by fuel fires, and littered with the white, twisted fragments of Patriot interceptor casings and Iranian missile debris. The silence that had settled over the base was heavy, broken only by the low, industrial thrum of the emergency generators. and the distant clatter of a single MH-60 Sierra helicopter returning from its final medical run. The base commander stood on the edge of the central crater, his shadow stretching long across the broken concrete. He held a tablet containing the initial damage assessment. The report was clinical, but the numbers told a story of a narrow escape from total catastrophe. Confirmed strikes, he read aloud for the secure recording. 7 Zolfaghar ballistic missiles. 5 successfully intercepted or diverted by the Patriot system. 2 direct impacts on primary infrastructure. 1 fuel storage bladder destroyed. 1 tactical operations center neutralized. The human cost was transcribed in spoken words to ensure the weight of each life was recognized. 11 United States personnel were confirmed killed in action. 75 personnel were wounded, with 15 currently in critical condition at the Regional Medical Center in Germany. The enemy's casualty count remained unknown, though intelligence indicated that the Iranian launch sites near Kermanshah had been struck by a retaliatory wave of Tomahawk cruise missiles launched from the USS Mason 90 minutes after the initial salvo. The strategic posture of the United States in Iraq had shifted irrevocably in the span of 4 hours. The gray zone of proxy conflict had been replaced by a clear, state-on-state kinetic engagement. At the Pentagon, the lights remained on in every corridor. The decision-makers were no longer looking at one base, they were looking at the entire global board. The strike on Al-Asad was not an isolated event, but a stress test of American resolve and technical capability in the face of a near-peer ballistic threat. The logistics teams continued their work in the morning light. The northern runway was now declared operational for C-13J Hercules aircraft, and the first mobile radar unit had successfully achieved a link with the Aegis ships in the Gulf. The American flag, though singed at the edges and smelling of smoke, was hoisted back to full mast at 7 in the morning. The report concluded with a summary of the tactical lessons learned. The Patriot system had performed at 80% efficiency against a saturating strike, a high number by any historical standard, yet the 20% that got through had nearly crippled the base's command structure. The necessity for deeper, multi-layered defenses and more distributed command nodes was now the primary directive for every U.S. installation in the region. As the morning wind picked up, carrying the scent of charred metal and dry earth across the Al-Anbar desert, the base settled into a new, grimmer routine. The wreckage would be cleared, the concrete would be poured, the dead would be sent home with full honors. But the memory of the 2 o'clock roar, the sound of the sky falling would remain etched into the psyche of every survivor. Al-Asad had held, but the world that woke up that morning was a far more dangerous place than the one that had gone to sleep.